Hello and welcome to the Car Kingdom Reviews channel, and welcome to the Subaru Ascent, a very interesting 3-row SUV from Subaru. And in today's video, we're going to do a proper technical review under the hood. We're going to take a look underneath the car. We're going to take a look outside, inside, for some things we like, some things we do not like about the Subaru Ascent right after this. Let's start our technical review under the hood. So the Subaru Ascent only has one powertrain. You have a 2.4-liter boxer engine, the FA24F, and a CVT transmission. Let us start with the engine because that's kind of Subaru's hallmark, the boxer engine. Let's start with its mechanical construction. Not at the top, but on the sides, because it is a boxer and we're going to walk our way in. So at the very outside, this has two banks because it is a boxer. You have plastic valve covers of the good quality variety, not the cheap flimsy ones. They're actually really high quality, and they did that. They switched from aluminum. They used to have aluminum in previous revisions of similar engines. They switched from aluminum for weight savings. The thing with Subaru boxers, they sit very low because the boxer is long and low, and that keeps the center of gravity low. That's why their cars usually drive nicer. Now, something they did really cool with this generation engine, this was kind of a boxer thing. When you make turns, all the oil would pull to one side because there was a cavity that contains it and start starving things. Here, they added kind of a big baffle that takes up that space between the cylinder head and the valve cover, so oil would not pool in one area. This is one of the kind of design weaknesses of the boxer engine because it's so long. So they did that to take care of that, and that is actually pretty cool. Moving on to the cylinder head construction. So this is a two-piece cylinder head. In case you're not familiar with boxers, they have 4 camshafts. Even though technically they only have 2 banks, or it's a 4-cylinder, but you have 2 cylinders and 2 cylinders, so there is 2 cylinder heads, and then you have 4 cams. Now, the 2 pieces of the cylinder head, the top is a cam cradle or carrier, which has the camshafts, and there's sealer in between them that goes onto the cylinder head. This engine does have roller rockers, but it has fixed lifters. It does not have hydraulic lifters. So the way they do valve adjustments, which are manual, they're not automatic, the tip of the valve has a cap or a bucket or a shim. It's a very small cap, and that cap, changing the size of that cap, is what adjusts the valve clearance. Something very strange. I wish they would have just, they have a very good design. They could have just replaced that fixed little lifter with a hydraulic one, and we don't have valve adjustments anymore, but that's not the way they went with it. The cylinder head, of course, is all aluminum, which is a little bit improved. So just a little bit of history in this engine. It has been updated in 2023 for the Ascent and a few other models. Before that, it's been going since 2019. So some of the updates in 2023 and up, the cylinder head got a few revisions, few updates internally, and then the block. The block's pretty interesting on boxers always. It's a 2-piece block. So the crankshaft sits in the middle, and then 2 pieces kind of come together and hold it. The rods are forged. The pistons are a special aluminum alloy, whatnot. Something that is always difficult with boxer engines is accessing the rods. And this is something that is good in this particular engine, unlike the BRZ, for example. So the rod itself, the cap is turned, so the bolts don't go straight in, they go at an angle. And the reason for that is you can actually remove the cap and pull the piston out with the rod without having to split the case. The BRZ, for example, you actually have to split the case, which is, it adds a lot more complication for service. The only thing that I don't quite understand, and I read it in the literature and I really did some research into it, they added a new coating on the cylinder walls, which is supposed to reduce oil consumption tendencies, because this is an engine that the pistons are laying on their side, and by gravity they're going to wear into the one side. But the other part that is confusing, the cylinder walls are thinner for, say, weight savings. Thinner cylinder walls will wear quicker. I hope that coating that they added really works, because this is a thing with boxers. Just by gravity, they tend to wear one side more than the other. That is the one thing about them. Now, the head gasket material, which is the thing with Boxers, although of the past, I have to say that, it is a steel 3-layer head gasket, so that is really nice. I hope they have gotten things better. Reports of head gasket issues have dropped significantly, and again, the reason they do have it, because of the shape of the engine and how gravity plays into the load of things and just pushing one side and not the other. Now, this engine, just like almost all Boxers of this generation, the chain ones, it does have 2 oil pans. The upper oil pan, which kind of it's a stiffening case as well, and it's a very important thing because it ties into the lubrication system. We'll talk about that in a second. But the bottom oil pan is still steel, not aluminum, and that is pretty cool because that is an area you're going to always be doing oil changes. You want it to be a little bit stronger than aluminum, which loves to strip all the time. Now, this engine, of course, have variable valve timing, but there's 4 gears because remember we said there was 4 cams. It does have 2 chains and 2 tensioners. The chains go from each bank to the crank. Crank sits right in the middle. Pretty interesting setup, but as a result of that, this has one of the largest front timing covers you will ever see, and they do have a tendency to leak, again, because of gravity and how things sit. It's a very large cover, very difficult and cumbersome to remove, and there's a lot of sealer behind it, and some sealer and Subaru lately have not been best friends, but if you're careful, you do things right, you should not have issues. Now, this, of course, is a variable valve timing engine, and the way it is managed is it's oil controlled. On the front of the timing cover, in front of each cam, there's a little solenoid, it has a little plunger. That plunger comes out, pushes on the middle of the gear, and that's what changes the flow of oil inside of it and changes the timing. Now, the fuel system in this car is direct injection only. The direct injectors sit right underneath the intake manifold, which is a very long behemoth because this is a Boxer engine. They sit underneath it. The fuel pump sits on the driver's side. This is something they've done with their chain engines and direct injected engines for a minute now. They do have really heavy insulation on it because they tend to be on the louder side, and the insulation here does work. You don't hear the typical chirp or loud ticking from it because the insulation is done well. Now, this has a return-less system. What that means is there's, of course, a fuel pump, a low-pressure fuel pump in the tank that brings the fuel all the way to the high-pressure fuel pump, which then pressurizes it to go in the direct injectors. But what they mean by a returnless is the pressure regulator that regulates how much pressure is making it to the front. It actually in the fuel tank with the fuel pump. So you don't have fuel coming here, regulator, and then fuel returning, unused fuel returning. No, you only have one fuel line, which is nice. The cooling system on this engine is extremely simple. I mean, as simple as they come. You have a water pump, mechanical, all the way to the bottom. Very familiar spot with chain engines from Subaru. No valve, no fancy anything, regular thermostat. Everything is very, very basic, and there's no overcomplication at all. Now, the lubrication system here, this does have a oil pump that is part of the front timing cover. It sits right at the nose of the crank. And this thing with Boxers and lubrication, they are a little bit delicate. The reason for that is you have such a wide engine and you have kind of the oil pump in the middle. It needs to spread the oil and go to the cylinder head, part of the block, other part of the block, cylinder head, and then elsewhere. So all that happens inside the timing cover. And this is where things with service especially are very important, and they tend to be on the delicate side. It's not something like only a specialist can do, but you need to have someone who have a little bit of experience with these, because setting the front cover is very important because the life of this engine depends on it, basically, because of the passages. Now, another thing with the lubrication system, which is very cool and something they added to this engine that other iterations before it did not have, not in 2023 though, this was added in 2019, is an oil cooler. That's very nice to have. This engine tends to run a little bit on the hotter side. Having an oil cooler is really helpful for it. Now, this engine does have an EGR with a cooler. EGR is exhaust gas recirculation, basically an emission device. Takes some of the exhaust gases and recirculates them back. So any unburned fuel, any emissions, they go back in the engine and things get a little better. Purely an emission device. But the only issue here I see is the location. It's all the way in the back. And Boxers, certain things that are normally difficult in normal engines are easy. Certain things that are very easy in normal engines, difficult in a Boxer, casing point, spark plugs, and the EGR valve because it sits all the way in the back. It's a little bit of a difficult area to access, but I hope they are not problematic and you don't have to visit them, because if they're not problematic, it could be an impossible spot to get and you'll never hear about them. And then the last thing about the engine is the turbo. Before we talk about the updates of 23, this is a turbocharged engine. A very interesting thing, because the other car that shares this engine is the WRX, which is pretty cool. So this turbo is oil and coolant cooled. It is an electronic wastegate turbo, which is not the best for reliability, but looking around and seeing how the quality of things, I'm hoping we don't have any issues in the future. But the biggest thing is the intercooler. This is an air-to-air intercooler, but no, it does not sit in the front. Remember, this is Subaru. It sits all the way at the top of the engine, which is a very iconic location. The only thing this intercooler is missing is a little stencil, some red paint for you to write STI on it. That is really cool. Now, the way this works is very interesting. See, normally in the hot model of the Subaru Impreza, you will have a hood scoop that brings air straight into that intercooler. But here, we don't have a hood scoop. So the way they did this is very interesting. They have all the plumbing, if you would, and then they extended the front grille higher so air would come in and go straight into the intercooler, basically doing the same thing as a hood scoop. But this would have been really cool to have a hood scoop, and we put a little STI WRX thing in the back. That would have been really cool. Now, before we switch to the other parts of the powertrain, let's talk about some updates, important updates in my opinion, that happened to the 2023 and up FA24. So the first thing they did, this has a new generation engine computer because of kind of the updating of emission regulations. So this has an updated wire harness, a different wire harness, and different computer and logic. And because of that, this also has different catalytic converters and O2 sensors, again, to meet that higher emission rating and requirement, and this whole new generation of engine computer and engine management. The other thing they did here, which was kind of interesting, the mounting of the engine to the subframe, they changed the little mounting to aluminum to save a little bit more weight. Because of that, the exhaust manifold had to change, and a little bit of few changes here and there. I don't know how much that would save, but the mounting to the engine now is aluminum, not steel, and we'll look at that a little bit when we go underneath it. The last thing they did, and although we're crossing into the transmission computer and logic also changed because it went to the next generation. And the biggest update that happened here, which is a huge deal in my opinion, this engine had a vacuum pump when its original iteration in 2019 because you need it for the brake booster. And that vacuum pump was in a very difficult spot to access. And even though they were not super problematic, but there has been some issues with them. Here, you have a block-off plate for that. You don't have a vacuum pump because this doesn't have a vacuum booster. This car actually, starting in 2023, has a very cool electronic booster. So they got rid of the old stuff, and we have basically a pump that pressurizes the fluid, and we don't have to deal with any other vacuum booster and the vacuum pump and all this stuff. That is a really good update, and the brakes feel immediate, and that is the nice thing with this car. Let's talk about the transmission and the all-wheel drive system, a very important system in any Subaru except the BRZ. Transmission here is a CVT Lineartronic. They have used this transmission for some time. Initially, there was some issues with the CVT, but lately things have been much better with this CVT, so we're hoping it stays reliable. As long as you maintain it, take care of it, there shouldn't be many issues. Now, the all-wheel drive here is a symmetrical all-wheel drive system, so it's a very serious all-wheel drive system, not like your most SUVs. As soon as you take off, it just disengages the rear wheels and it does nothing. No, this is an actual all-wheel drive system with a multi-plate disc clutch that splits the torque. It could do a proper 50-50, so whenever you are driving this car, it's always in one form, shape of all-wheel drive. Never just front wheel or rear wheel drive. It's always driving four wheels. The split is controlled with this clutch, and that is something that they do, and they do very well. Now, the front differential is a proper front differential and is separate in a separate housing, but it is kind of built into the transmission, but they do not share fluids, and that is the cool thing. And we'll look at a little bit more at that when we look underneath the car. Now let's talk about some of my observations just looking underneath here as a mechanic, and I actually have some experience with Subaru because If you don't know, I am a Toyota Lexus master diagnostic technician. I own my own shop now, but I worked at a dealership for years and years. And we had the FRS, which is exactly this engine, and we did a lot of engine work on them. But the Boxer engine is a very unique engine. It requires a lot of maintenance, a lot of care if you want it to be reliable, and they can be reliable. But looking around here, it brings a little bit of nostalgia seeing the intercooler here, but I love one thing. Even though this got updated and this is a super high-tech engine with new generation ECU and whatnot, the Subaru way doesn't change. Oil filter is right here, very simple. Drive belt accessory and all the accessory belt, very simple. Water pump, very simple. Everything is proper. All the hoses have the proper clamp on them. Everything is high quality. You look at the radiator, it's high quality radiator. All the plastics, everything feels solid. And that's why you buy a Subaru. And I love it. And look, folks, the Boxer engine has its quirks service-wise, but this iteration, I really like it. They fixed a few things that were really common things where we always wondered, why can't they fix this? And they did. Like the oil pooling situation, that's a huge deal. Like the lack of oil cooler in previous generations. Well, we have it. And they kept the rest normal. If you've worked on a previous chain engine from Subaru, this is exactly the same, just with very good improvements. And the biggest thing is the quality of everything. There's not cheap, flimsy things here. And that is really appreciated, folks. That's one. It should be one of the top reasons you would consider a Subaru, not just Ascent, but any Subaru, is how well they do things here and underneath the car. Let's take a look underneath the Subaru Ascent. And the first thing is pretty decent cover here. It is plastic, but it is good quality plastic. So if you had a little bit of an adventure like somebody did in this particular car, you would be somewhat protected, although not so much, because this would actually hit here. But here's the interesting thing. Subarus have, for the longest time, they've been like this oil filter at the top, and then the drain plug on this one, you don't even have to remove any covers. It's just right here. Beautiful. I like that. Now, we talked about this being the updated version since 2023. You notice where the mount hooks up to the engine right here is actually the top is aluminum. Might be a little bit hard to see. We'll show a little clip of that here. But they changed that to aluminum for size, for weight. So they also changed a little bit of the exhaust manifold. The exhaust manifold on Boxer engines, in case you're not familiar with them, especially Subarus, they sit at the bottom. So you can see part of it right here, the exhaust manifold. See part of it right here, and that's where the turbo is and everything. Pretty interesting setup. Now let's look at the front suspension here. Pretty strange setup on this particular one, because the ball joint is separate, but it sits on the knuckle itself, which is steel, and then a steel control arm. There's really nothing aluminum here. And that's, I think, for reliability and counter rigidity is better. Dual piston caliper. This is, of course, a bigger SUV, so you do need bigger brakes. And they are bigger, but the rotors could be bigger. Let's put it this way. McPherson strut design at the top. Nothing really out of the ordinary. And this is the Lineotronic CVT transmission with the front differential sitting right here. So the cool thing is, you notice where the axles come out. Easier to see it here. It looks like it comes out of the transmission, but actually the differential is here. So there's two separate compartments. This is the transmission, and this is the front differential. It's just mounted directly to it, and then connected to the engine at the top. Very interesting transmission, kind of a hallmark of Subaru. You only have one drive shaft going to the back. You don't have another one from the transfer case. It's all internal in the transmission, which is a very compact, very cool setup. As we walk back from that, you notice this car has some covering, and this adds to why this car is quiet. It is actually quieter, on the quieter side of things. And I like the fit and finish. And this is something that Subaru always have done well. When you notice all the panels, all the cedar application, everything looks neat, even here where nobody's going to look. One thing I noticed about this car, the subframe has this little contraption here that is for support. I mean, usually these cars don't have a big subframe because they just have the area where the suspension mount, but this is pretty interesting that this extends all the way back here. That is a pretty interesting setup. We move back here. Exhausts. I'm trying to find the best word to describe it on Subaru. They're not the best, but they're not the worst either. This one included, it's decent. It holds. I hope we don't have issues with it in the future with early rust or leaks or whatnot. But drive shaft is right here. It does have a center support bearing, very wide open and clear, not buried behind stuff. So if you need to surface anything, that is nice to have. This has a saddle tank. So the fuel pump is on one side, and you just have kind of a jet that comes to the other side and pulls fuel from both ways. So it's pretty cool, an interesting setup here. Differential, huge deal, at least in Subarus. This is not a aluminum differential. It is actually cast iron. It does have the cooling fins here that are aluminum, but the diff itself is cast iron. Heavier, yes. Heavier duty, though, yes, that as well. This is something about, I mean, if you're buying this car, this should be one of the top reasons you're buying it. Their all-wheel drive system is really good and way above anything you're going to buy in this segment. That is how good it is, and it is standard. So even if you buy the base model, you're getting this exact same thing. Let's look at the rear suspension. So it's a multi-arm rear suspension. Everything is steel. There's no aluminum here. Some folks will take that as that's not good. It's actually good for longevity, and Subaru does things the Subaru way, and longevity is on their list. If you look at the brakes, single piston caliper with the electronic parking brake. This is where they are going with what the automotive industry is going, which is the right way. Got rid of the parking brakes and the rotor hat and all this complication. This is much simpler, even though some folks will disagree. Folks, trust me, this is a lot simpler and easier to work with. We look at the back, you do have a spare tire. It's not a full-size spare tire, but it is spare tire nonetheless in a very good location outside of your storage and whatnot. Then we look at this. See, this is what I told you. Subaru doesn't follow the trends. They do the Subaru thing. This is covered. Not 100%, but I'll take this over basically some luxury cars that have this wide open. This is covered. You don't have a giant collection area here on air brake, which I really appreciate. Now this one does have dual mufflers, not really a dual exhaust, single exhaust, splits into two, and you have mufflers. Things are very basic here, and I just looking underneath here, I really appreciate that there's not just an insistence on having everything made out of aluminum. Folks, aluminum is great for weight, but you start mixing aluminum and steel in the same area and dissimilar metals, and you have salt or rust on top of that, things are going to get interesting with service down the road. Subaru doesn't do that. Most of their things are steel, especially the suspension stuff, which is really appreciated. Let's take a look at the outside of the Subaru Ascent. And I have to make a small disclaimer. This is not my favorite looking Subaru. And what makes it even worse is this is not my favorite color Subaru ever. So with that, let's start. The only thing I see about this car is it's a typical Subaru and everything, but it doesn't look like an SUV. It just looks like a Subaru Outback that is taller and higher and bigger. And it just, because of that transition, there's odd proportions about it. For example, this grille or this entire front look, I think what makes it off in the front, and I have to say this part and this high line of the hood is what makes it odd looking in the front. And this is not just a part that is there for decoration. This is where the intercooler air comes in because there's no hood scoop. As we talked about when we did the technical review, this is where that comes in, and it just makes it look odd. There's no other way to say it. I like the headlights, even though they are basically they feel stretched and big, but they're okay. But just the way the hood comes in and kind of stops and you have this shape gives it a strange look. Could be just me. Looks are, after all, a matter of taste. As we roll to the side, though, there are a few un-Subaru things. Look at this body line. Starts here, comes down, then it kind of disappears. Then another line starts and goes all the way to the end. Then it disappears at some point, and another line starts. I feel like it's a bit much, especially for Subaru. They're usually very sensible about their designs. Now, this is actually a little bit raised out. Same thing with the back. Not a lot, but it works. But my biggest thing is This is not body color. This is not a low trim. This is one of the higher trims, actually, not the highest, but higher. There's a lot of black cladding, unpainted. Car of this price, I would like to have this not be black cladding. I can understand that they were trying to do this because this can be used somewhat off-road because it has a lot of ground clearance and it has a very capable all-wheel drive system. But still, the door is lock only in the front, not in the back, which is expected in this segment, so that's nothing against them. I do like that all the trim is blacked out. It gives it a little bit of an interesting look, possibly with a different color. That's just my 2 cents personal opinion. Moving around the back, it's the same thing. So these taillights are basically the cross-track taillights stretched and made bigger, at least to me. And then you look at the back, it just doesn't look like your average SUV. And it's the same story when you kind of look at the whole thing from the back. It doesn't feel like an SUV. There's something, I don't know. I might be just the only person on the planet seeing this, but it doesn't look like an SUV. It just looks like a very high hatchback or a large station wagon. But then the badging. This is where they got a little bit carried away. Subaru symmetrical all-wheel drive. See, here's the problem. Every Subaru is symmetrical all-wheel drive except the BRZ, and then Ascent Onyx Edition. A little bit carried away with the badging here, and if we put the Subaru badge, why do we need to say Subaru? But that's the way they did it, and I wish Subaru would get rid of this. They're all symmetrical all-wheel drive, we don't need to say it. But let's look in the back here. And this is, I think, where things start coming up. This is a 3-row SUV. This is actually decent space behind the 3rd row, and that's where things get a little better. The angle of the door is not extreme, because this is basically, for lack of a better word, a giant box. It's a little bit curved, but not a lot, and that is nice. And then if we fold the seats, which are manual, that's a decent amount of space. But here's where I have a small problem with the captain chairs. First, folding them down is a 2-step operation. You have to do this, then do this. But then this doesn't actually fold completely flat. I wish this does that. Now this particular model we're testing does have the captain chairs. Possibly the bench will fold a little flatter, but this actually doesn't fold flat. You notice the high angle, and it is a 2-step process. I wish it was a 1-step process to fold it. Not the end of the world, but a small observation here. Now underneath here, you do have a little bit of storage with your tonneau cover here, which is nice. Of course, the spare tires underneath it, as we looked at in a little bit. And this is where things are good. My favorite thing is you put the 3rd row up. This is decent space. Now, this is not a very, very large SUV, but still, this is a usable space behind the 3rd row seat, not like some SUVs that actually don't have any usable space behind the 3rd row. Now, the last thing is the door itself. Subaru also uses something became a standard in the automotive industry. The motor actually lives in the shock. So, fortunately, the only downside of that is if one of these goes out, you can't operate the door manually, and that's kind of the downside. But what I do like is this does have just to close and lock the car, which is a nice feature to have. Something very interesting here, design-wise, that there is some bumper. See, most cars these days, they're losing the bumper completely, where this sits right at the edge. Anything hits it. Here you have some bumper. And this has to do with, again, Subaru doesn't follow the trends, or at least don't follow them quickly. But then there is this. I feel like it was meant to be for a trailer hitch, but then it's a little overemphasized for a trailer hitch to have this big of an access panel. And and it's also this very unpainted, unfinished finish. It doesn't look very high trim level. The looks department, this is not, in my personal opinion at least, not the best looking Subaru on the planet. Let's take a look at the interior of the Subaru Ascent. And I have to say one thing, I have mixed feelings about this interior. Let me elaborate, please. See, there's a lot of good things here, a lot of family-focused details here that really matter, but then there are some quirks and some strange things that just they could really use improvement. Even when we just updated this car, I wish they would have done a little bit better on some of the updates. Let us talk through it. First thing is the gauges. They are not your typical SUV giant screen that does absolutely nothing. No, there's two physical gauges and a screen in the middle, and I love it because we do not need to make this car more expensive than it already is with a giant screen that does absolutely nothing but mimic two gauges. And they didn't do that, and I love that. That's the Subaru way, the good Subaru way. Steering wheel, very easy, very featureful, but it's very easy to operate. There's no confusion. Everything is very clearly laid out, and I love that, including the heated steering wheel button that is right on the steering wheel. That's a very interesting touch, and it does make sense. Now we move to a center stack here. This is where things get a little strange. So this is the latest infotainment system from Subaru that is mostly good, but could use some tweaks to make it even better. I mean, they went for the lengths to make this really the centerpiece of this car and many of their models, but they removed all the physical controls. The only thing you can change is the temperature and put a defrost and the rear defrost, front defrost, rear defrost. I would have wished that that was the case. However, they are always displayed at the bottom. But here's a strange thing. Some of the options are not there. You have to physically open and see it. Same thing with the brake hold. Same thing with many of the controls in the car that would have been fine being a button. Now it's a two-step operation. And sometimes this system, the response of the screen is not 100%. So sometimes the two-step process becomes a four-step process because you press something, it goes somewhere else, and now you're completely distracted. And another thing that got added here is driver monitor. And we're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later in the video, but it basically an infrared camera that sits right on top of the infotainment system, always watching your face. If you blink, it'll start yelling at you. If you slightly get distracted by the very distracting infotainment system, it'll start beeping and alert you that you're not paying attention. That is the basic premise. Now, moving on from that, proper physical shifter. Even though we lost many of our physical buttons here, this is still a proper shifter with a cable, and things are normal there. Now, the seats are pretty comfortable. I actually really like the seats. Some Subarus at some period of time didn't have the most comfortable seats. I think these seats are pretty comfortable. But the interesting thing about this interior is it doesn't have wowing materials. I hope that makes sense to you. But the interesting thing beyond that is even though everything basically is plastic except the seats, some of the stuff here and there, they're high quality. They don't feel like they're one bump away from falling apart. And that is really the appreciated thing here. Things are made well. Not very high-end materials, but they're made well. The seat leather, it's not the highest, toppest, nicest leather that we've seen in some SUVs in this segment, but it is nice. But the most nice thing I can say about this interior is it's just quiet. It's not luxury car quiet, but we've driven some SUVs. You take them on the highway speeds, they're pretty loud. Around town they're okay, but highway speeds are loud. This one is actually pretty nice and is well insulated. It's well behaved. The only concern I have is the center feel of the steering feels a little vague. It's not very sharp like some SUVs we've driven, but it is not bad, and the car composes itself and handles pretty well for the size of the SUV and kind of the intended purpose. And one very strange thing about this SUV, or I should call it SUV, it doesn't feel like an SUV. It actually feels like a very large hatchback. That's a very large cross-track. That is the feeling here. You just doesn't, the driving position and the way the hood looks and just everything, it doesn't feel like a large three-row SUV. I don't know how to describe it. If you sit in one, see one in person, you will know exactly what I mean. It has a hatchback feel that is very large, but it's no way, shape, or form a hatchback, because this is a very large three-row SUV. Let's talk about the second row seat in the Subaru Ascent. I'm 5'7". This is my driving position. I have decent knee room. decent headroom, even though this has a panel sunroof, which usually drops the headliner down a little bit. Pretty comfortable chair. You do have two options here. This is the captain chair, and I love that the middle is open, so your kids can come in here and go to the third row without having to fold the seats and you assisting them and all that. And the second option will be a bench. So this can be a 7-seater or an 8-seater, depends which trim you get, which options you get. I do like the fact that you have a kind of a third climate zone and climate controls here in this particular model that we're testing here. I do like the fact that you have a sunshade. Now we're not expecting an automatic sunshade here, but you do have a sunshade, a manual one, which is to be expected, and it is a nice feature. Something about this car, and this is something we normally don't talk about in the channel because you can see that with your own eyes, we don't have to tell you. They were very proud of the number of round openings that you can put your round objects in. So we're going to say there is a lot of them. The number I read was 19, and that will be the end of the discussion of round objects in a round opening in the car to store your personal items. Let's talk about the third row seat, which is actually a 3-person seat. I'm 5'7". This is my sitting position in the second row and my driving position. This is tight. Now, in fairness, you can push the seat forward, but now you're taking away space from the front. So if you have adults in the second row seat, a little bit taller, this will not be as big. But the nice thing is, I can't demonstrate it in the seat I'm sitting in, you can move the back and forward. Like you can recline this back, which makes it a lot. Actually, I do have a little bit more knee room, and you can live with it. Can you sit adults here for a 12-hour drive, kind of a road trip? Probably not. They will start complaining. And when they start complaining, you can immediately talk to them calmly, because this car has this kind of a speaker system where you talk in the front and it projects your voice in the back, which is a really nice feature if you have little kids and you're driving on the road and they can't hear you, or they pretend they can't hear you usually. Now your voice is being projected through the speakers and they could definitely hear you. Let's talk about some things I do not like about the Subaru Ascent. Starting with its price, at least in this particular trim that we are looking at, and when you go up from that. This is the Onyx Edition, the higher Onyx Edition, the 7-passenger one with the captain chairs. I feel like at this price point, you are deep into territory of some seriously good 3-row SUVs. And that, when you put this car in the middle of some of those SUVs, they do better. Even in the reliability and the build quality on some of them, that will work against the Ascent. The other thing is the driver monitor system. Look, safety is great, safety features is great, but when you are a normal driver who is not distracted normally, it could use some work. First, it's on by default, so you can shut it off, but then every time you restart the car, it's on again. And then there's a distinct red light that is always in your eyesight, and it does get distracting. There's always a red light in your face. You always tend to look at it, and that is, I feel like they could have hidden it a little bit better where it's not immediately in your eyesight. The other thing is the infotainment system. While it's a great start and something pretty interesting to see in a Subaru, it needs some work. Like the HVAC system, you can customize some options, but then you only have 2 spots to do that. We'd like some things to always be there. If we took the physical controls, most of the everyday options should already be there. We don't have to pick what to put or what not to put there. That, I think, could use some work. Otherwise, the system works well. The car does have some really good features, but I feel like they took a lot of the physical button stuff and put it in the screen, like the brake hold. You have to go, it's now a 2-step process instead of just pushing a button and not be distracted. And usually when you get distracted, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get beeping from the car to keep your eyes on the road. Well, I'm just trying to turn on the brake hold or shut it off or do something, not really being distracted. But the 2 systems kind of work against each other. It's not a great idea. So should you buy a Subaru Ascent? Folks, I really like Subaru's way. See, Subaru's way is a way that doesn't follow the trends, they live in their own world. They do cars the Subaru way, and people do buy them because it's actually a good way. But this is a three-row SUV in 2024. And in 2024, every other manufacturer have 17 million shapes, sizes, style of SUV, 3-row and 2-row, and every single thing in between. Every manufacturer have many SUVs. And that last part is gonna work against the Ascent and the Subaru way. I cannot actually come up to a conclusive finale for this one as an opinion if you should buy one or not. So I'm going to do something instead. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of the Subaru Ascent because it has some really good stuff. It has some stuff that are questionable. That's the best way I'm going to put it. Let's start with the good stuff. And the biggest thing is it's made well. It's not fancy. It's not luxurious. It's not a wowing car. But for a sensible person, which by the way, it happens to be who usually buys Subarus, it is well made. It is not glued together with cheap glue and cheapest zip ties. It is well made, and that is the very important part. The interior is decently quiet for its segment, and that is actually a big thing. The biggest thing with this car, biggest positive is, if you have a family and you like going into the wilderness, you like some off-roading, not heavy off-roading, but some off-roading, this is really, in my opinion, very near to the top because their all-wheel drive system for the longest time have been one of the best. And you feel it in this one. And the other thing is the turbocharged engine. While it is turbocharged and direct injected only, and let's say there has been some issues with turbocharged Boxers in the past, seems solid. Time will tell on reliability of this engine because it's somewhat new, at least in its most updated form. But having a CVT in an SUV this big usually is not a good idea. But this engine and the way it's insulated and the way everything is programmed, it doesn't actually drone, or at least doesn't drone bad. And that is a really good thing. You still have the efficiency of a CVT, but it's not droning all day long. And that is really nice. Now, it is not perfect. On the looks department, you will decide for that because that has personal taste in it. In my opinion, it's not the best looking SUV in the planet, or let alone in Subaru land. It feels like a modified Forester or something like that. And then the other thing is, it doesn't even look like an SUV. It just feels like a very large hatchback. And that has to do with the styling looking like everything else. So when you look at it, it doesn't feel like a typical SUV that every manufacturer has 17 million shapes and sizes of. And that could be good for some, could work against it in other areas. But then when you get inside, infotainment system, for example, initially when you look at it, it's very interesting and cool until you start using it. I think they are really on a good track with this infotainment system, with a large screen and everything. But this is a Subaru. The Subaru way says you should have physical buttons for almost everything. This one doesn't. And the biggest problem is, with small software tweaks, this could be a lot better. But here's what usually happens. This is what I found driving this car for a week. By the time you start to figure out you want to configure your HVAC and you want to change this, that, your driver monitor system will start beeping that you're not paying attention. And it's like, well, I'd like to pay attention, but the infotainment system could use some work and I have to turn around to it to operate it. And that's the interesting mix here. The driver monitor is one of the things I dislike. I like safety, and I understand that we need to have ways to monitor the driver, make sure they're paying attention for the safety of themselves, their family, and our families and other cars driving as well. But the way they implemented this, when it's on, it's very hyperactive. It's a little bit on the extreme side. And the second thing is, which is the most annoying to me, there is a distinct red light always in your field of vision. And I feel like that's very distracting to me, could be distracting to others, and that could be a deal breaker for some. Folks, do you see how the Subaru way a little bit gets in the way of this SUV being really one of the top? Unfortunately, this will have a specific buyer that wants that all-wheel drive, wants the Subaru way. And I feel like Subaru is such a good company. They did such good work behind the scenes in this car. I feel like with small tweaks, especially the infotainment system, maybe that driver monitor, change the location of the camera, things will be even better, because otherwise, if you're not buying this for looks and show off and latest and the greatest, it's actually a decent SUV, because that's what Subaru does. Quality, and you see it immediately. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some other videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.